Welcome back to Behavioral Science for Brands, a podcast where we bridge the gap between academics and practical marketing. Every other week, we sit down and go deep behind the science of some of America's most successful brands. I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
And today we're sitting with Matt Johnson, speaker, researcher, and writer specializing in the application of neuroscience and psychology to marketing. He's the author of Branding That Means Business, that came out just a little over a year and a half ago, and co-author of the best-selling consumer psychology book, Blindsight, the mostly hidden ways marketing reshapes our brains. Let's get into it.
Fantastic.
So Matt, welcome to Behavioral Science for Brands. Richard and I have made a little mission for ourselves to find the best applications of behavioral science, bring them to marketers, and having what we think are very interesting conversations in the world of academics, practical marketing, and just trying to make the unspoken spoken and really get conversations started. So if I can just give you a little introduction and then add to it, and then we'll get into the conversation. Before the show, we were talking about how you kind of went straight through schooling, and your last bit of schooling, you got your PhD in cognitive psychology at Princeton University, and you really have spent a lot of time exploring the science behind brand loyalty, experiential marketing, and consumer decision-making. You're a columnist for Psychology Today. You're a contributor at Forbes, Business Insider, BBC. And I love this in your bio that you said you are really weighing in on the human side of business. So we have a lot to talk about today, but maybe you could start at the beginning. Our listeners love to hear stories. Maybe you could tell us a little bit how it all started. How did you get introduced to behavioral science? How did you come to cognitive psychology? What's the story behind how you found this passion?
Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be with you both. And so for me, being in my younger days in high school, undergraduate, I was just really driven by a sort of a fundamental curiosity about why we do what we do. I think really everybody has these curiosities. They always sort of wonder why, you think a certain way in a certain social group and or feel a certain way in a different social group, or why you made this decision or that decision. And I just perseverated on these curiosities. I couldn't get past them. I couldn't just go on with my day. I had to study them, had to try and get to the bottom of these things. So ended up pursuing my undergraduate degree in psychology and neuroscience at UC San Diego, and then went straight away into the PhD at Princeton, where I specialized in sort of the neuroscience of perception and communication. So how we sort of take in the raw sensory signals from the environment, how we interpret these, how we build these rich inner experiences that really only we can have. So consciousness is by definition a private experience, but then we can share these ideas and we can share these interpretations, we can share ourselves in the social world. And this is this general process called communication. So what is it at a psychological and sometimes neuroscientific level that allows us to do this? And so essentially, I'd gone straight away. As we were talking before we hit the record button, I was in essentially 26th grade at one point, and just kind of looked up and wanted to do something a little bit different. And so, quite frankly, it was a total reaction move. At the age of 27, after I finished my PhD, I moved straight to Shanghai, China. So moving from a town of 20,000 people, very myopically focused, very academic town, to Shanghai, China, which is 22 million people. And going from an academic life where your pursuit is truth, doesn't matter how specialized, doesn't matter how myopic, doesn't matter how niche, truth is the North Star, to a business environment where the North Star isn't truth, the North Star is action. Truth can be in service of action, but really we're trying to figure out, what's the best next step to do. So a totally different city, totally different environment, totally different North Star. But it was this incredibly refreshing period in my life. And what I thought was going to be this very reaction move, do the complete opposite thing. This is what really led me to see this incredible intersection between psychology, which was my discipline academically, and the business world. And for me, this intersection was most fascinating and most unexplored, really in the realm of marketing. So now it's been really cracked open. This is also around the same time that Daniel Kahneman wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. I had the opportunity to work and interact a bit with Danny in my graduate studies, and so for me, behavioral science was really the way to kind of crack this field open and start thinking about how these principles from psychology could be applied in a marketing context. So really ever since then, after coming back to the States, that was 2015. So going on, 10 years or so, my work and my research and my writing and my speaking has really been about how do we understand the human condition? How do we understand it psychologically? How do we understand it neuroscientifically? And then how do we harness these insights and apply it to brands to help them better understand consumers, better serve consumers with creativity and and with all sorts of human phenomena.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think there's always that intrigue when you take something that's been very academic and then you ask what's the application layer? How can I take all of this massive knowledge and start to apply it? And you did that in really in both of your books, right? I mean, this has been the effort to take these academic principles and start to make them applicable for people to use. What was that experience like?
That's the idea. Yeah. So there's this classic plight of any academic, and I still consider myself an academic because I'm still engaged in research. But you kind of reflect back and you kind of zoom out bigger picture, and if you're fortunate enough to get some papers published, some insights published, maybe somebody's going to read them in a year or two, maybe 5 years, maybe someone's going to try out the ideas, maybe 10 years, it's going to get adopted into a very small
Yes.
aspect of an organization. So, and that's a best case scenario. And so I think, there's incredible base of knowledge in the corpus of academic research, which isn't known to the general public and shouldn't just be, sort of locked away behind the paywalls of academic journals. And that really has rich application, both for people to think differently about their lives and how they interact, and also for organizations that are looking to better understand their consumers and better serve their consumers. So,
Matt, why do you think more businesses don't access that information? Because you would think the profit motive should suggest that businesses are clamoring for this work. Rather than having to employ a team of researchers at your own expense, you've got academics generate insights into what motivates people. It's there sometimes behind a paywall, sometimes freely accessible. Why don't more businesses naturally turn to academia to get these insights?
I think there's a variety of reasons, but I think it's primarily two things. So one, I think at this point, whether in marketing or in HR, people realize that understanding human beings and understanding psychology is crucial, right? So unless you're doing something that's very specialized in like quantitative finance and it's literally, it's devoid of human beings, there's a recognition that businesses require an understanding of people. I think when organizations look at their ability to do that, they already have a model of how people behave. They already have this model of human psychology. And whether or not, that they're, having this sort of scientific, they're availed of scientific insights or not, they already have this model. And so they just haven't gone the extra mile of having this to be tethered to sort of our best understandings of the cumulative wisdom. So the recognition is there, but I think a lot of times they stop and say, oh, we need to understand people. Oh, we understand people. I'm a person, you're a person, my spouse is a person. I get it. And, maybe I've read some popular science books from the 1990s. I read Malcolm Gladwell. I get people, right? So I think they recognize the need, but they feel they check that box off. And I think the second reason is, of the people that do recognize the need to bring, more up-to-date, science in, there really is this disconnect between the academic insights, which aren't written for a general audience, right? So if you look at even trying to read an abstract of a peer-reviewed paper, it's written by scientists for other scientists to help them be able to understand these insights, so we can, build this cumulative corpus of scientific wisdom, and it can be built on, it can be iterated on, but it's not written to be applied or even to be understood by the general public or to organizations. So there really is this gap between sort of the rich, raw insights and their ability to be applied much more broadly.
Matt, I've heard you talk in the past about a third issue, which is the matter of trust, meaning that there is a general distrust between consumers and brands, but also between maybe this is a question amongst academics and business leaders as well. I don't know if you have anything to share on that, but I've heard you talk about this issue of trust.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I mean, there's definitely mistrust between, consumers and organizations, companies for sure. Different sectors, this is going to fluctuate slightly, but there's some general distrust there. But yeah, I'm trying to think if there's distrust between, sort of academics and corporations. I mean, I think there's a general just cultural tension, right? And I experienced that firsthand myself as I was making that transition. I think there's this, it's kind of this stereotype of sort of a corporate juggernaut, that you're just out there as a captive industry trying to optimize profitability at the expense of everything else, and just, human capital converted into profits for shareholders. And that's what the stereotypical academic thinks of the stereotypical corporate person, right? But
Yes,
neither of
correct.
those things are really true. In my experience working in academia, you're working with incredibly smart and curious people that are not just curious about their discipline, but are curious about the world. In my experience working with corporate people are some of the smartest people that I've met anywhere, both in academia and in every walk of life. And so I think in some ways they're not as dissimilar as maybe they would think that they are, and they're kind of ships passing in the night effectively. The other thing I might add to that is I do think there is this kind of interesting tension between academics like myself that kind of have a foot in industry, where there's sort of this it's almost like a cultural taboo, where if you go and you consult and you go and you apply some of these insights, you're kind of selling out, right? You're not doing it for this noble pursuit of truth, which is an axiom I believe in and I subscribe to, but now you're doing it for some instrumental value for some corporation. So I do think there's some cultural taboos and sort of bridging this gap a bit as well.
And I think this is a red thread through a lot that Richard and I have explored over the past few years, is breaking down that taboo and trying to say, look, we can all learn from one another, and sometimes there's a direct financial instrument that's helping academia and corporations benefit. And sometimes it's just for the sake of greater knowledge. And what we can do in corporate America is we can test in ways that academics would have longer lead times, might have a limited amount of ability to test in so many different ways. So there's really a great connection between having academics and having corporate leaders partner together to come up with refining insights and better application.
Absolutely, and I think especially in the realm of marketing, I mean, the North Stars there are really so closely aligned. I mean, as an academic, as a psychologist, as a neuroscientist, I'm fundamentally curious about why we do the things that we do, right? As a marketer, that's keeps you up at night. Why do my consumers behave as they behave? Do we have a looming recession? What's that going to mean for consumer behavior? We have substitutability now in certain types of products. What's that going to mean for my brand loyalty? How are people going to behave? I think one of the mistakes marketers sometimes make is they do use this word consumers, right? And as soon as you label these people as consumers, then they become something a little bit different and they become a little more alien. But if
A
we can
little less
start
human.
a little less human, absolutely. But of course, consumers are human beings. They do much more, as we all do, than just consume. They're much more than lifetime customer value. And so I think if we can think about our consumers, in air quotes, as human beings that have an incredibly vast portfolio of interests, one of which is to consume and support themselves and gather the products and services that are in line with their values. But if we can broaden that scope and understand this broader portfolio, we're able to really tap into their lives and their values in deeper and more enduring ways.
We've talked a bit so far about the kind of principle of applying behavioural science to marketing. If we can move from principles to practicalities, are there any concrete examples you think of brands that have taken a behavioural insight and applied it brilliantly?
Yeah, so one phenomena I really like to see in the marketing world is this idea of unpredictable reward. So it's this very sort of general phenomena that's been observed where what we would enjoy actually a bit more if it came as a surprise. So there's some very classic pieces of research done by Greg Burns at Emory University, where he had people lie awake in the fMRI scanners. So I think most listeners will know, but fMRI, this is functional magnetic resonance imaging, allows us to eavesdrop on the brain as certain processes are happening. And so in this particular experiment, Greg Burns and his team had them lie awake in the fMRI scanner while they're just sipping juice. So you got these like tasty bursts of juice. And you had two groups. You had group number one, and the intervals of juice came regularly and predictably. So you had like a span of 2 minutes, maybe 20 bursts, and they always happened every whatever that is, 15 seconds. In the other condition, you had the same overall amount of juice, so that the total volume of juice was controlled for, but now it came at this random, unpredictable interval. And then they asked people afterwards, how much did you enjoy it? How much would you want to do this again? And it was no contest. Condition number two, far and away, was the preferred mode. And then they looked at the neural data and they get a really telling signal, which is that you get increased activation in a region called the nucleus accumbens, which, as most behavioral science listeners will know, is essentially tantamount to our brain's pleasure center. So when we're having an experience, merely by coming as a surprise, we get a sort of boost to how much we enjoy that. And we see this really play out in a number of different domains by clever marketers. So one of my favorite examples of this is a brand you're no doubt familiar with, Richard, which is Pret a Manger, which is everywhere. Every corner store in every intersection in London has one of these. And what they've done is they've created this incredible system called random acts of kindness, right? Mm-hmm. And so what random acts of kindness does is it takes what is ordinarily good. So free coffee is good, but free coffee by surprise is great. So that's the basic insight from the Greg Burns experiment. So juice is good, but juice by surprise is great. So they applied this to coffee, right? So free coffee is great. And so you imagine a scenario where you've got your lunch, you got your loyalty card, you got your punch card. You know that you're going to go up to the barista, you're going to hand this over, and you're going to get your free coffee. So that's good. Free coffee is good, but how can you deliver the same experience by surprise? And so what they do is they have, as I mentioned, this random acts of kindness fund. So you go into a Pret a Manger and you go up there maybe even expecting to pay for this coffee as you ordinarily would, but now the barista it's their own discretion, decides, hey, you know what? This one's on me. And so every barista is encouraged to do this. They have a certain amount of funds they have for this. And so from the standpoint of the consumer, they had no idea this was coming. And so when they get this compensated drink for free, it comes as a pleasurable surprise. And so they rolled this out as a very small campaign in the US and the UK. It became so successful that they now rolled it out, and it's the standard in all of their locations.
So it's a brilliant example. I think a bit like the fMRI experiment, because essentially it's cost neutral if you compare it with a Starbucks or a Cafe Nero who do the loyalty cards. You buy 10 coffees, you get a next one free. All those brands are giving away free coffee. You might as well use behavioural science to make that gift as powerful as possible. And totally. Not only, as the evidence and the experimental evidence shows, it will make the drinker happier. I also think there's a lovely benefit for the staff. They are being empowered to have that degree of control. So it works on so many levels. That's a lovely example.
Oh yeah, no, totally. It's a great example of applying this, because one might think, all right, so you want to provide unpredictable reward, but if you apply this reward consistently, does it then cease to become unpredictable? And so it's about developing these broad systems such that you can continuously, you build this contingency where you might get the surprise sometimes. You don't know when it's going to come, you don't know how it's going to come, you don't know who's going to be surprised by it. And it's that element of sort of anticipation and inconsistency that actually keeps us kind of coming back again and again. It's worth noting, of course, that this is the classic variable reward system, which is employed in every social media feed. It gets sort of hypercharged and sort of keeps us coming back again and again and again when we don't want to. So it can be misapplied. But I think in scenarios like we spoke about with Pret a Manger, there's other direct-to-consumer companies that do this very well, where they are, taking stock of what consumers naturally enjoy. So you take like a Bark Box, for example, which has a direct-to-consumer sort of monthly subscription. We give you a monthly box full of goodies for your dog. And they take a survey at the very beginning where it's like, okay, what kind of dog you have? What are their general preferences? What are their allergies? And then each month you get a kind of random, surprising assortment of things that are going to be in your sort of pleasure zone. But you don't know exactly what you're going to get. So it's another way of creating a broad system where you're delivering consistently surprising pleasures.
Oh, brilliant. So you mentioned Pret. The other one that I love in this area, it's a bit smaller than Pret, but there's a chain of Indian restaurants in Britain, probably only 15 or 20 of them, called Dishoom. And within quite strict parameters, like it's not the popular evenings, it's times you normally wouldn't want to go and have a curry. They will bring out a brass dice at the end of the meal, and you roll the dice. I think it's called a matka. And if it comes up 6, everything you've had is free. Now, to the accountants, it's just like giving a 16.666 discount. But to the recipient, wow. I mean, you should see the place if someone wins. There's an eruption of excitement. They'll be posting about it for ages. And it's almost like alchemy. You have turned exactly the same amount of discount or freebies into something more powerful. I think uncertain rewards and this variability is a lovely idea.
I love that example. I think I may have heard it from you, Richard, maybe in a previous conversation, because I give this example all the time when I teach psychology of pricing. That, of course, from a strict economic standpoint, as marketers, pricing is very important. We should obviously optimize for willingness to pay, and that means sort of making our price commensurate with the demand, et cetera. But then there's these wonderful examples where you have moves that would make no sense from just a sheer economic standpoint. Like how much sense does it make from a sheer accounting standpoint to give away a meal, every 6th time, et cetera, with the dice roll? But it's an absolute genius move when we zoom out and sort of examine the broad impact that we're having on our consumers. And we're really, is the glue that brings it together is, of course, the unpredictability of it, right? So if you just come to a table and say, hey, you know what? At the beginning of this meal, you're going to get it for free. That's great. Free food is great. But remember, free food, something great, something, good plus a prize equals great. So something we would ordinarily enjoy, which is free food, by surprise is a way to sort of galvanize the pleasure response. Yeah.
And I don't know if there's behavioral science behind what I'll say next, but there is also when you get unprompted social proof, eruptions of cheers at Dishoom, or there's a Pret downstairs in our office building. They come up and whoever got the free coffee or the free pastry is telling the whole office that like how lucky they feel. That unprompted, unscripted social proof to me is a real additional benefit. It's additional benefit, but it also, as a marketer, a practical marketer, tells me I'm onto something. Like if you can elicit that, you just have this genuine sense that it's adding value for your brand.
Yeah, oh, totally. Like I would imagine, and maybe Richard could speak to this, but everybody that wins, I mean, the amount of just organic social media that comes out of that, again, unprompted, unsolicited, but you get a free meal and it came as a surprise and you're there with all your friends and the restaurant cheers for you and you're rolling these bronze dice. I mean, that's just, it's gorgeous. And I imagine you get this just eruption of again, sort of unsolicited social proof, which I think is the most powerful because it's seen as the most organic and most authentic.
Well, there's plenty, I think, other brands can take from that. So that's a great example. Are there any other times where you've seen brands apply a behavioural insight brilliantly?
So there's this one phenomena that I'm a huge fan of, especially when I'm doing research now on sort of AI human interactions. And this is this idea of the psychology of essentialism. So it's this observation from perceptual psychology that as human beings, we're not primarily sensory creatures, or we're not merely sensory creatures. Then when it comes to the appreciation or the value that we ascribe to an object, we tend to see its sort of deeper essence, its soul, essentially. So there's a great experiment called the significant objects experiment, which was done back in 2017. And what they did is they bought a bunch of objects on eBay, and these were just ordinary objects, like the most bland anodyne object you could imagine, like a Pez dispenser, like a little yellow ducky, like a little charm bracelet. Because they bought them all, they noted the prices. It was anywhere between $1 and $5, so relatively inexpensive. And what they did is they hired a team of writers, and they tasked the writers with giving each of them an origin story. So they could just make up an origin story. This is how this specific duck came into being. These are the designs that went into it. This was the specific, production that created it, the hands that made this duck. And they gave each of these a story. And then what they did is they put that story in the caption for the product and put it back up on eBay. And they noted how much the prices would go in this online auction. And the prices increased about 70%. So what was, previously a little yellow ducky that went for $5 now went for like $35 or $40, and nothing changed. So the product was identical, but now it has a story. Now it has an essence. And so this is this incredible observation from perceptual psychology that, when we see an ordinary object, we don't merely see its sensory properties. Our ideas and our beliefs about the origins of that product really strongly enhance our perception, our valuation of it. So this is helping explain, for example, why we value so much more the original piece of art as opposed to a pixel by pixel forgery, right? So if you had a Mona Lisa right here, the original Mona Lisa, and you have an identical forgery, like nobody can tell unless you are an art aficionado. Like you can't tell pixel for pixel, it's identical. And yet one is priceless and the other would go for $50 if you're lucky. And really the difference that makes the difference is the deeper essence that the original has. And because it's the soul, because it's the essence, it can't be replicated because it's not within sort of the physical constituents of the art itself. And the applications that I love for this are really primarily in the F&B industry. So this is what Perrier utilized when they brought their sparkling water to the US. So this is back in the 1970s. Nobody really had an appetite for sparkling water yet. It really wasn't a thing. And they first brought, Perrier, and they tried the French thing. Oh, it's French water and French extravagance and this and that. And, American consumer wasn't buying it. What they ended up doing is launching this very intense marketing campaign where they actually flew journalists to the geysers where this is harnessed from the earth in France. And they did this sort of like excavation where they go to it, and they had this incredibly well done commercial where they have Orson Welles narrating it and talking about how it's from the belly of the earth and it's from the earth itself. And it really was talking about the origins of it and sort of the foundational story of it. And then they put that as sort of front and center of their marketing for this product, and sales absolutely took off because you felt as if you were drinking this kind of like mythological, geological beverage. It really, our appreciation of it was really informed exquisitely by our understanding of its origins.
That's a fascinating example. I mean, there's the insights are really interesting. I think the other thing that brands could learn from is the technique. If you go back, there's a straw man sometimes of psychology, behavioural science that critics use and over exaggerate. But if you go back to the 1950s, often the experiment might have been done with 25 undergraduates. And there's a problem of representativeness. There's a problem of, do people behave differently if they know they're in an experiment? But thinking of eBay as a laboratory, not just in this idea of essentialism, but you could test social proof or scarcity, listing one item one way, another item another way, and zero recruitment cost. You've got an amazing insight into what people do. So I really love this idea of eBay as the kind of modern behavioral scientist's laboratory.
It's a great point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I mean, going back to we were talking about pricing earlier, like the second place auctions are a fantastic way to test pricing because you have, I mean, that's what eBay really specializes on. Like how much, I want to sell some old golf clubs. How much should I price them? What's my market going to pay for them? What's their willingness to pay? I have no idea. The market decides. Yeah. I put this up here, and that it's price discovery mechanism like the stock market. And how much is it worth? it's worth whatever the market is willing to pay for it. And so you're absolutely right. If you could sort of test different items, different times of day, different variables, different captions, and sort of iterate on that with these different variables. Yeah, I think that's a great way to test how much a product is valued and how these variables influence that.
Yeah, the other build on this concept is that so often we'll meet marketers in the real world that will say, well, the problem is the product. The problem isn't my brilliant marketing. The problem is the product. And if only the brand, if only the company would fix their product, then my marketing would work. And this is a really great example of, there's a lot more to it. Of course, a product that doesn't meet the needs of the user. Of course, there's those issues. But what you were talking about, which is the sensory properties and the idea of the origin story behind it and what your connection to it is all in the domain of the marketer. And so we may not be able to fix the repurchase, but we certainly can control the trial of something using this insight.
I think it's an insight that could be used so much more. There's a restaurant that Michael and I've been to called Bob Ricard, and it's famous for its champagne button. You press a button, then the waiter comes with a glass of champagne. But I think the other thing that they did was, and I might be mixed up restaurants in my mind here, but they had one of the wines, dessert one. And this is something I do not like, a dessert wine, not particularly a fan, but it was described as like Napoleon's favourite wine. It was the stuff, this kind of Constantina wine or something that he had when he was on St. Helena, and it was the only thing he would drink. And I'm like, once I read that, I've got to drink this stuff. Even though it's very $5, $10 beyond my budget, I had to drink it. And it's exactly what you're saying. I mean, the liquid didn't taste any different. What did it matter if Napoleon liked it? But I had to have it. And the idea that it costs absolutely nothing to try and dig a little nugget like that out of a brand's history, add it to your menu and reap the benefits.
Oh, totally. No, I think it's especially ripe in the restaurant industry because, as both of you know, our sense of taste in terms of our the accuracy of the sensory signals is the most impressionable, right? So as human beings, we're strongly visual creatures. We're not gustatory creatures, and so our ultimate perception of what we're eating is really shaped emphatically by our beliefs about what we're eating, right? So you imagine that you're sitting down and you're enjoying a steak, and then the waitress comes up and like, oh, I'm so sorry, Richard, that one fell on the floor. And you've been enjoying it this whole time. You were having these tastes that you thought you were enjoying, and now this knowledge, which again didn't taste it was the same steak you were eating before, but now you have this belief, and this belief is going to shape very significantly your perception of the next bite if you are to take a next bite. And so this is what's done. You do see it sometimes in restaurants. I don't think they do it they don't sort of optimize for it, but really providing this incredible story, like you said with your Napoleon example. I mean, I was at a restaurant a couple of years ago back in the Bay Area. I don't know if either of you follow the NBA, but we have this incredible superstar from the Bay Area, one of my favorite players, Steph Curry, and his wife is really this fantastic.
Very lucky you said his name because there's about 3 basketballers I could name, and that's one.
There we go.
I'm with you. I know all about this basketball stuff. Yeah.
So his wife Aisha Curry is this great restaurateur, and she has this restaurant in the Bay Area called Aisha Smokehouse, and it's fine that the food is good. It's decent. It's there's nothing to write home about, but she does this incredible storytelling where like on the menu, like each item is like, Steph's layups, right? And it's like has this little story about how Steph practiced because they were like childhood sweethearts. Like Steph would practice his layups and then his dad would call him in and he would eat these, specific meatballs or whatever it is. And so you feel like you're eating Steph Curry's childhood, and like, who knows? Ordinarily, maybe they're just, store-bought microwaved meatballs, but like you feel as if you are in the story. And, I would guarantee you, if you were to like Pepsi challenge this, like it would taste differently to you just based on the belief itself, because that's how impressionable our gustatory domain is.
Oh, fantastic. Now, I know we're quite up against time here, but I'm loving these examples. So do you think we could squeeze one more example in? Could you tell us like a final example maybe of another practical application of behavioural science?
Yeah, so I think one thing we tend not to do as behavioral scientists sometimes is sort of zoom out and look at sort of the social group. So all of these phenomena kind of focus on the individual, but I think it's also worth kind of zooming out and looking at us as social creatures. And so there's a great number of phenomena which has been noted around this idea of countervailing influences. So this general idea in sociology that when you are expressing a belief or engaging in a behavior which is counter to your group and counter to the norms of your group, you're basically going to get a lot of shtick for it. Your friends are going to, are going to tell you that that's not right. Your friends are going to, point out all the flaws in this, and that's really going to impede whatever behavioral change would have taken place. So, if, for example, you are a strict Thatcherian Reaganomics person, and you stumble into a seminar on UBI, Universal Basic Income, that might, tilt your views somewhat. But then guess what? You're going to leave that seminar. You're going to go back to your group of friends who are also Reaganomics guys and Thatcher people, and like, oh, that'll never work. You're a communist. You're you're a socialist, etc. And guess where those burgeoning UBI beliefs are going to go? They're going to go right out the window. And so this is something that marketers, I think, could harness a bit more when they are encouraging consumers to adopt products that similarly sort of go against the social grain. And so there was a fantastic example of this again in the Bay Area. This was Mickey Agrawal. She had this, it's still around, this brand called Thinx. And what Thinx is she's trying to re-envision panties for women. And so these panties are period proof. So you can wear them all the time. You can wear them any time of month, and you don't have to wear any other feminine hygiene products. You can just wear the panties, and that's it. So this is an orthodox product, and her strategy was to really try and she did advertisements which were based on individuals. She did sort of classic advertisements, but really what set her apart is she recruited at a group level. So she didn't try to convert individual people, because when you convert individual people, just like that that Reaganomics guy going back to his Thatcher friends after the UBI seminar, you're going to get a bunch of shtick for that. And that's going to, you go back to your girlfriends and say, hey, guess what? There are these period-proof panties. And your friends will be like, period-proof panties? That's a crazy idea. And like, oh, yeah, it is a crazy idea. But what she did is she recruited groups of people, groups of friends. So she had, 5 or 6 people. She would host these meetups, and she would say, hey, bring 5 friends. Bring your entire friend group. If you bring 5 people, you get a free something. She incentivized it. And then she was able to engage the entire social group and recruit at a group level. And when you recruit at a group level, everybody has the same conversion experience. And you then don't get, importantly, these countervailing influences which can impede behavior change.
That's fantastic. Reminds me a bit of there's a wonderful podcast, Diary of a CEO, that Whitney Wolf, I think the founder of Bumble, appears on, and she talks about doing something very similar. So for her, the problem wasn't that they were doing something radically different, although I guess you could argue Bumble's quite different from some of the other brands. But it was the fact, if you want to launch a network and you have a small advertising budget and you spread it thinly across San Francisco, well, it's never going to work. So she recruited in groups. She would go to a single dorm on a single university campus and throw all her efforts at bringing that group together, and then moving one by one until she had a large spread scale. So I love this idea of thinking about groups rather than individuals when you're trying to launch a business or change a behavior.
Yeah, no, I think it's huge. I think the Bumble example is crucial. I mean, it's so hard to create a social community. You look at Google, $2 trillion company. When they shut down Google Hangouts, that was the 4th failed attempt at creating a social media network. And people ask, well, why did Bumble IPO pop so incredibly when you have Match Group, you have Tinder, you have Hinge, you have all these things? Is because she created a social community from scratch. That's incredibly difficult to do. Even the biggest tech groups in the world, can't do it. So yeah, she deserves incredible kudos. And I think, sort of these types of social marketing, which doesn't approach individuals, but really brings in these strong ties and does marketing as a group, can, I think, be really effective there.
So cool. So cool. Well, listen, we've had a really wide-ranging, interesting discussion. As we come to a close, Matt, we always like to ask our guests one final question. Um, and it doesn't have to be related to behavioral science or your area of study. But what's a favorite thing right now that you're reading, that you're watching, that's got you thinking? We're always on the lookout for new things that are stimulating. What's got Matt Johnson's attention right now?
Ooh, it's a good question. Yeah, right now, I mean, it's about this kind of new wave of generative AI. I mean, it is overhyped, but it's not overhyped in the same way. So I feel like we had our hype cycles, and we had it at, the hype label was properly applied when it came to NFTs and blockchain and crypto and all of that, and now we see now in in 2024 these incredible technologies, these incredible LLMs of, we're talking in the case of GPT-4o, 1.7 trillion parameters. And it's just some incredible demos. I think the jury's still out in terms of exactly how this will innervate the business world. But I do think it's probably the biggest technology that we've seen since the iPhone and maybe even the internet. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to keep my sort of the fingers on the pulse of it. It's hard, of course, because it's moving very, very quickly. But yeah, just trying to stay up to date as much as possible on the newest technology. But then, of course, my research at the moment is really trying to understand, the insights about how we can, as human beings, interact with these AI agents, because there's a lot of evidence for this. We talked about essentialism earlier, but there's a lot of evidence now that we do, in a very real way, exhibit a kind of anti-AI bias. So if you have, for example, a picture and you say, how beautiful is this picture? Like, oh, it's beautiful. It's 9 out of 10. And then you're saying, oh, by the way, it was created by AI. How beautiful do you think it is now? It's a 2, it's a 3, right? So you do have kind of an intellectualization of aesthetic experience. And I think it's a really interesting intersection, and we're just sort of at the beginning of it now. So that's the new thing that I'm very interested in these days.
So interesting, especially when you think about how many companies are trying to use AI for operational efficiency, like customer service chatbots. But when it's not a human on the other side, it's AI, your experience would go down based on your example. Just interesting to think about how that will affect the implementation of AI in all sorts of areas.
Oh, totally. Yeah, no, we swap paintings for customer emails, and we get an identical pattern where you have people rate, how efficient is this email? How, articulate is it? How warm is it? How competent is it? How intelligent do you think the person is who wrote it? And people are like, oh, this is a great email. It's fantastic. I would love to get this email. And then you say, oh, by the way, it's created by AI. Like, oh, now it's a terrible email. Now I don't trust it. Now I don't like this organization. Now I don't think it's efficient or any of these positive traits. And so, yeah, the email, of course, stayed the same, of course, but it's this belief about its origins, again, tying back into essentialism, that really fundamentally shifts how we perceive it and how much we want to have these kinds of interactions.
Fascinating. Thank you, Matt, for joining us today. We will make sure in the show notes to put links to both your books, and I know you have a really great blog, so we'll make sure to share all that with our listeners and to the community that's listening. As always, please share questions that you have, comments that you have, and until next time, I'm Michael Aaron Flicker.
And I'm Richard Shotton.
Matt, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. A lot of fun.
Behavioral Science for Brands is brought to you by Method One. Method One is a team of modern marketers that practices the art and science of behavior change to fuel growth for indulgence brands. We do this by building interconnected marketing ecosystems that place the human experience at the center of brand building strategies across owned, earned, and paid media. To learn how to leverage behavioral science in your marketing or advertising, visit us at www.methodone.com.